10 million bicycles, 90% of every skate in the NHL, a 250,000 square feet of factory floor in Weston, Ontario, where the same workers built bikes in the summer and forged skate blades from Sheffield steel in the winter. The two halves of a Canadian childhood from one building on Lawrence Avenue. Then the owners changed. 3 families in 3 decades. One extracted, one fought, one starved. The 10-speed revolution came, and the factory couldn't build one. Not on equipment that hadn't been updated since the plant was new. In 1983, 600 workers were given 2 weeks to shut it down. The factory stood empty for 3 years. Then they demolished it. Today, a Tim Hortons serves coffee where 10 million bicycles were born. This is the story of Tommy Russell, a farm boy from South Huron who built CCM from a failing merger into an empire. And the men who inherited what he built couldn't see past the margins to the product and let the most recognized brand in Canadian manufacturing die on a factory floor they'd refused to maintain. 3 letters that meant childhood, and the silence that replaced them. Chapter 1: 5 Factories and a Methodist Syndicate. The story begins with a defensive merger. 5 bicycle companies, 5 factory floors, 5 sets of owners who couldn't stand each other, all forced into the same room by a threat from across the border. It was September 1899. The American Bicycle Company had just consolidated 42 manufacturers into a single colossus, and its leadership announced plans to open a Canadian branch plant called the National Cycle Company. If that happened, the domestic industry was finished. Canadian bicycle makers didn't have the scale, the capital, or the distribution to survive a direct American assault, so they did the only thing left. They merged. Canada Cycle and Motor Company Limited was incorporated in Toronto, Ontario, binding together Massey Harris's Silver Ribbon bicycles, H.A. Lozier's Cleveland Line out of Toronto Junction, the Welland Vale Manufacturing Company in St. Catharines, the Gould Bicycle Company in Brantford, which shipped 100 bikes a day and held nearly every Canadian Class B cycling championship, and Gendron Manufacturing, an American origin outfit making the Reliance. At formation, CCM commanded roughly 85% of Canadian bicycle production. Combined annual output ran to about 40,000 bicycles. Approximately 1,700 people drew a paycheck from the new company. Investors purchased some $2 million in shares. Serious money in a country still figuring out what it wanted to be. The man who pulled it together was Walter Edward Hart Massey, president of Massey Harris and son of Hart Almarin Massey, whose agricultural machinery empire had made the family one of the wealthiest in the Dominion. Walter was 35 years old, a vice president of the Toronto Board of Trade, a director of no fewer than 10 businesses, and a Methodist, which, in late Victorian Toronto, was less a denomination than a membership card for the commercial elite. Behind him stood a circle the Dictionary of Canadian Biography would later call the Peterborough Methodist Mafia. Senator George Albertus Cox, simultaneously president of the Canadian Bank of Commerce and Central Canada Loan and Savings, whose interlocking web of directorships sat at the heart of Toronto's financial establishment. Sir Joseph Wesley Flavel, who ran the National Trust Company and would later prove the most consequential CCM board member by recruiting the one man capable of saving the venture. Alfred Ernest Ames, Cox's son-in-law and a prominent stockbroker. Warren Soper, connected to the Dunlop Tire Company. They were financiers, deal makers, institution builders. Not one of them rode a bicycle, not one of them had run a factory floor, and the company they'd assembled fell apart almost immediately. The bicycle market was already saturated. More than 25 manufacturers had operated in Canada by 1898, and in Toronto alone, 90 bicycle shops served a population of roughly 180,000. The safety bicycle, with its diamond frame and pneumatic tires, had democratized cycling through the 1890s, creating the world's first mass-market consumer luxury. Cycling clubs stretched from Halifax to Victoria. Over 70 hotels between the Maritimes and Manitoba advertised rates for touring cyclists. But by the time CCM was born, the automobile was arriving and the boom was ending. Managing 5 separate factories in Toronto, Toronto Junction, St. Catharines, Brantford, and beyond proved a nightmare. A fire destroyed the Welland Vale bicycle works in May 1900. Lawsuits consumed management for 3 years. Investors called the directors the big syndicate and accused them of skimming. And then, in October 1901, Walter Massey contracted typhoid fever and died. He was 37 years old. His estate was valued at over $760,000. His company was worth considerably less than its investors had been promised. CCM needed someone who actually knew what he was doing. Joseph Flavel found him. Chapter 2. The Man from South Huron. Thomas Alexander Russell was born on April 17, 1877, in Usborne Township, South Huron, Ontario, farm country near Exeter, where his father bred shorthorn cattle, and the nearest thing to industry was the rhythm of the seasons. He earned a B.A. in political science from the University of Toronto in 1899, finishing top of his class. His high school classmate in St. Mary's was Arthur Mahan, who would one day serve as Prime Minister of Canada. Before he turned 25, Russell had taken the position of Executive Secretary at the Canadian Manufacturers Association and boosted its membership from 132 to over 900 in 18 months, launching the magazine Industrial Canada along the way. In 1902, Flavel brought Russell into CCM, and the young man went to work with a directness that bordered on violence. Those who knew him described Tommy Russell as young, blunt, aggressive, slow to smile, impatient with small talk. He had a philosophy, and it was simple enough to fit on a factory wall: shared responsibility, to give to the public a good article at a fair price, and give to the working man the fullest share possible of the return which they helped produce. Within 12 months, Russell had consolidated all manufacturing into a single plant, the old H.A. Lozier factory at 408 Weston Road in Toronto Junction. He closed factories in Brantford, St. Catharines, and Hamilton. He eliminated retail stores in St. John's, Montreal, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and London, England. He traveled to Australia and New Zealand to sell off 22 of 26 overseas retail branches. 5 scattered operations became one focused enterprise, and CCM started making money. But Russell wasn't content to build bicycles. In 1903, he acquired the assets of Canadian Motors Limited and began experimenting, first with a steam-powered locomobile, then with an electric runabout called the Ivanhoe. Both failed. Russell learned from both. In 1905, he launched the Russell Model A, a 2-cylinder gasoline automobile priced at $1,500, and it became what most historians regard as Canada's first successful car. By 1910, Russell automobiles ranked third in Canadian sales, trailing only Ford and McLaughlin. The automotive division was reorganized as the Russell Motor Car Company in 1911, and Russell secured exclusive Canadian rights to the night sleeve valve engine from the Daimler Motor Company of England. It couldn't last. The cheap Ford Model T was an economic argument no luxury car could answer, and by 1915, the automotive division was sold to John North Willys of Willys Overland in Toledo, Ohio. But the automobile experiment produced something far more valuable than cars, something that would define CCM for the next 80 years. The decision came in 1905, and it was born from a practical problem. Bicycle sales slowed in winter. Workers sat idle. Russell needed something to keep the factory running through the cold months. The answer was sitting on the shop floor. Scrap stainless steel left over from automobile production. Russell's team began forging it into ice skate blades. CCM's automobile skates, named for the metal's origin, entered the market as blades only. Boots were sold separately. It was a side venture, an improvisation, a way to keep paychecks flowing from November to March. Nobody in that factory in 1905 could have known they'd just created the most iconic hockey equipment brand in Canadian history. For 22 years, CCM had the skate market largely to itself. Then, In 1927, competition arrived from an unexpected quarter. The Western Shoe Company of Kitchener, Ontario, trading as Bauer, introduced the first skate to leave the factory with the blade already attached to the boot. It was a direct challenge. CCM responded by finding the best bootmaker in the country. George E. Tackaberry was a shoemaker in Manitoba who had revolutionized hockey boot design in 1905 at the request of his neighbor, a hockey player named Joe Hall, who would go on to win the Stanley Cup. Tackaberry's innovation was the use of moisture-resistant kangaroo leather, which held its shape on the ice when cowhide went soft. CCM began sourcing Tackaberry's boots to pair with their blades. When Tackaberry died in 1937, the company acquired the brand outright. Tax. The name would stay on CCM's flagship skate line for decades, and eventually more than 90% of NHL players would lace up CCM blades. Tommy Russell had taken a failing bicycle syndicate and built an industrial company that made cars, bikes, and skates that employed hundreds, exported to 40 nations, and armed the country in wartime. The philosophy he'd nailed to the wall, shared responsibility, quality for the public, fair returns for the workers, had made it all possible. He served as the government's automobile purchasing agent during the First World War. He sat on every board that mattered in Toronto. And on December 29, 1940, Thomas Alexander Russell died. He was 63 years old. He left behind a company at the peak of its powers. He also left behind a question that nobody in the boardroom was asking. What happens when the man who believed in the work is gone and the men who believe in the margins take his place? Chapter 3. Arsenal and Empire. During the First World War, part of the CCM plant at 408 Weston Road was retooled to manufacture ammunition. The company shipped Planet model bicycles to Europe for military use. Sturdy, single-speed machines, packed in crates and ridden by soldiers who needed quiet, reliable transport behind the lines. It was the first time CCM's production served something larger than commerce. But it was the Second World War that revealed the full capacity of what Russell had built. The Canadian government declared the CCM factory an essential war service and took over its manufacturing facilities. The Weston plant, by then the massive new complex on Lawrence Avenue, turned out simple, one-speed military bicycles, stripped to essentials. Chrome plating was replaced with chemical blackening. Metal badges gave way to paper decals. And in 1942, when the rubber shortage hit, CCM engineers fitted the pedals of their Rambler bicycles with wooden blocks instead of rubber treads. Workers solved problems with what they had the way workers always did. The CCM Rambler found its way into the hands of American, British, and Canadian forces. At least one RCAF squadron received CCM bikes overseas. Every bicycle that left the Weston loading dock, packed in a wooden crate, loaded onto a railcar on the tracks that ran along the factory's south side, carried a quiet boast, made in Canada for the war by hands that knew what they were doing. Between the wars, the factory had already outgrown its original home. By 1916, the old Losier plant at 408 Weston Road, 137,000 square feet, couldn't keep up. CCM built a new complex at 2013 Lawrence Avenue West, on the south side of Lawrence, east of the railway tracks, in what was then the separate municipality of Weston. 232,000 square feet of factory floor. Head office, manufacturing, assembly, shipping, all under one roof, backed onto the Grand Trunk and the Toronto Grey and Bruce Railways, which had served Weston since 1856 and 1869, respectively. Weston was chosen because the railway was there, the land was there, and the workforce was there. It was a self-governing town, incorporated as a village in 1881, elevated to town status in 1914, with its own schools, police, fire services, and mayor. It wouldn't be absorbed into the larger municipal structure until 1967, when it merged with the township of York. The people of Weston knew who they were, and increasingly, who they were had something to do with the factory on Lawrence Avenue. Inside that factory, the work was specific and physical. Frame tubes were brazed, Cranks and pedals were forged. Skate blades were heat-treated from Sheffield steel. The Prolite blade, introduced in 1934, made from English steel, hardened to an edge that held through a full season of hockey. Assembly lines turned out bicycles in dozens of models. Children's bikes, adult bikes, racing bikes, commercial models. Hockey equipment followed the skates: helmets, sticks, gloves, protective gear. The place hummed 6 days a week, and at peak capacity, 900 bicycles rolled off the line every 7 days. Over 400 people worked there during normal operations. Many of them lived within walking distance, in the small houses clustered around Gibson Avenue, homes built specifically for factory workers, north and east of the plant. The walk to work in January meant frozen sidewalks, breath hanging in the air, the factory's glow visible before you reached the gates. Inside, the forge threw heat that pushed back the cold. The contrast was the rhythm of the place, the Canadian rhythm, winter pressing in from every direction, the factory floor pushing back with noise and warmth and purpose. By the time the Second World War ended, CCM had proved what it could do under pressure. It had armed a war effort, kept a community employed, and emerged with its reputation for quality intact. What it did next, in the peacetime decades that followed, would make it something more than a manufacturer. It would make it part of childhood. Chapter 4: The Cathedral on Lawrence Avenue. By the early 1950s, CCM had achieved something rare in Canadian business: total cultural saturation. The company didn't just dominate its markets, it occupied the imagination. The numbers told part of the story. In 1917, CCM accounted for 85% of all bicycles manufactured in Canada. By 1930, only 3 large bicycle makers remained in the entire nation, down from more than 25 in 1898, and CCM was the largest by a wide margin. Toronto-made CCM bicycles were ridden in 40 countries across the British Empire and beyond. By mid-century, the company claimed more than 1 million of their bikes were on Canadian roads. Over the brand's 101-year history, more than 10 million CCM bicycles would be manufactured. But statistics can't explain what CCM meant. To explain that, you'd have to walk through the Weston factory in its prime, say, a Wednesday morning in 1958, and follow a bicycle from raw steel to shipping crate. You'd start at the south end of the complex, nearest the railway tracks, where lengths of high-carbon steel tubing arrived by rail car. The tubing came from English mills, Sheffield steel, the same stock used for the Prolite skate blade, and it arrived cold, dull gray, unremarkable. By the time it left the building, it would be a CCM Flyer, or a Rambler, or a kid's first bicycle, painted and decaled and boxed for a dealer in Saskatoon, or St. John's, or some town in Australia where the CCM name still carried weight from the export days. The brazing shop was loud and hot. Workers joined frame tubes at precise angles, the acetylene torch throwing blue-white light against the factory walls. The smell was sharp, flux and heated metal, and the faint chemical edge of welding gas. Down the line, the crank forge operated with a rhythm you could feel through the soles of your boots. The press cycling every few seconds, stamping steel into the components that would connect pedal to chain to wheel. Pedals were assembled by hand, bearings packed with grease, cages fitted, spindles threaded. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was automated in the way a modern factory would understand the word. These were skilled hands doing repetitive work to exacting tolerances, and the pride was in the consistency: 1,000 pedals, each one right. The assembly floor was where it came together. Frames arrived painted, CCM's signature red or blue, or the cream and maroon of the Flyer, and workers built the bicycle outward: bottom bracket, cranks, chain, wheels, handlebars, seat, fenders, chain guard. Each bike was test-ridden on a short stretch of factory floor before being approved for crating. A man could build 6 or 7 complete bicycles in a shift if the parts flowed and nothing jammed. In winter, the other side of the factory came alive. Skate blades moved through heat treatment ovens, the Prolite process that hardened Sheffield steel to a precise temper, giving the edge its durability. Kangaroo leather uppers, sourced from the Tackaberry line, were stitched and lasted onto boot forms. The blade was riveted to the sole plate, and a finished pair of CCM tacks went into a box that would end up under a Christmas tree in Medicine Hat, or Charlottetown, or Timmins. The smell on the skate side was different: leather, adhesive, the faintly sweet scent of heated steel losing its temper in the oven. 900 bicycles a week, skates by the thousands through the winter, hockey sticks, helmets, gloves, pads, all of it from one building on Lawrence Avenue in a town that still had its own mayor. Chapter 5: The Brand That Was Childhood. The products themselves became legendary, and the legends weren't accidents. They were built on racing victories, NHL endorsements, and one of the shrewdest youth marketing campaigns Canada had ever seen. The CCM Flyer was the flagship, a top-end racing bicycle with butted main tubes of high-carbon English steel, introduced around 1923. It was ridden by Willie Spencer, who broke 5 world speed records and won the American Speed Championship 3 times in the 1920s. And it was ridden by William "Torchy" Pedden, a 6'3", 220-pound Victorian with flaming red hair who won 24 of 48 six-day races between 1929 and 1933, represented Canada at the 1928 Olympics, and became one of the most colorful athletes the country had produced. In 1938, CCM presented Pedden with a gold-plated CCM Flyer that now sits in the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. The CCM flight arrived in 1936, designed by Harvey Peace, a CCM employee who filed the patent on October 23, 1935. It was the only bicycle for which CCM ever sought patent protection, an aviation-inspired machine built from airplane seamless steel tubing that looked like nothing else on the road. At $45, expensive for the Depression, it never sold in volume. Its rarity made it a collector's prize decades later. Then came the CCM Mustang in 1965, CCM's answer to the Schwinn Stingray, a wheelie bike with high-rise handlebars and a banana seat that became the obsession of every kid on every street in Canada. The Mustang Marauder was the one you wanted. The early models came with a stick shift, a suicide shifter between your knees, which was dropped after the 1972 model year when somebody in the safety department finally prevailed. On ice, the dominance was absolute. At the NHL's first All-Star game in 1934, CCM advertising, featuring legendary broadcaster Foster Hewitt, boasted that 25 of the 33 players wore CCM blades, roughly 76% of the league's best. Charlie Conacher and King Clancy of the Toronto Maple Leafs endorsed CCM's matched set skates. Conacher told customers they were light and lively. Jean Beliveau wore tacks. Bobby Orr wore tacks. Wayne Gretzky wore CCM, including the HT2 helmet that became as recognizable as the number 99 on his back. Mark Messier, Paul Coffey. The connection between CCM and the NHL wasn't a marketing partnership. It was the foundation of the brand. The helmets deserved their own story. George Parsons had been an NHL player, a forward who was forced to retire in 1939 after a career-ending eye injury. He went to work at CCM and poured his understanding of the game's violence into developing hockey helmets and facial protection. The safety equipment that came out of Parsons' work changed the sport. A man who'd lost his career to an injury the game didn't protect, again spent the rest of his working life making sure fewer players would suffer the same. But it was CCM's marketing to children that cemented the brand in the national psyche. Beginning in the 1930s, the company produced thousands of scribblers, the lined exercise notebooks that every Canadian schoolchild used, with pictures of the newest CCM bicycles and skates printed on the covers. Every school day, for decades, children held the CCM brand in their hands. It was the most effective youth marketing campaign in Canadian history, and it cost almost nothing. The most famous promotion went further. CCM urged parents to buy a bicycle as an incentive for good grades. If your boy doesn't pass his exams, we will take back the bike and refund your money. It was brilliant and irresistible. The promise of a CCM bike turned report card day into something electric. And when adults abandoned bicycles for automobiles in the 1920s, CCM pivoted fast, locking up the youth market with a made-in Canada pitch that played to both parental pride and childhood desire. Women were targeted too. Advertisements from the 1920s and 30s promoted cycling as a fashionable form of exercise, a strategy that reflected both the era's fixation on women's bodies and a genuine expansion of who the bicycle was for. By mid-century, the pattern was set. A Canadian kid got a CCM bike in the summer and CCM skates in the winter. The factory on Lawrence Avenue supplied both sides of the year. And for the workers inside that factory, the ones brazing frames in the spring and riveting skate blades in the fall, the seasonal rhythm was the job itself. Bikes in summer, skates in winter, paychecks year-round. That was the deal Tommy Russell had struck, and for decades it held. In 2022, the Government of Canada designated the Tackaberry Skate as an event of national historic significance. Minister Stephen Guilbeault noted that getting a pair of tacks, new or used, had been a memorable rite of passage for many young Canadian skaters. A government minister, 85 years after CCM acquired the brand, officially confirming what every kid who'd ever laced up a pair already knew. Chapter 6, The Summit. The peak arrived with a handshake and a check for $125,000. In 1968, CCM President Tom Neese signed Chicago Blackhawks superstar Bobby Hull, the Golden Jet, to an endorsement contract worth $25,000 per year for 5 years. In an era when endorsement deals in hockey were virtually unknown, the amount was simply unheard of. The deal helped land Hull on the cover of Time magazine that March. It hadn't happened by accident. George Parsons, the same man who'd turned a career-ending injury into a life's work designing safety equipment, had noticed something about Hull's skating. Hull was cutting the back seam out of his skates for comfort, hacking apart expensive equipment because nothing on the market fit him right. Parsons designed a custom-fitting alternative. Hull switched to CCM, and when Neese put a contract in front of him, the most exciting player in hockey became the face of a brand that was already stitched into the country's identity. The Bobby Hull line of medium-priced skates gave CCM instant appeal in the youth segment. Every kid who watched Hull accelerate through the neutral zone, that unmistakable power stride, the slap shot that terrified goalies, wanted to wear what he wore. For a few years in the late 1960s, CCM had everything: the factory, the products, the history, the NHL's biggest star, and the loyalty of every Canadian child who'd grown up with their scribblers and their Christmas morning tacks. The Weston factory employed over 400 people in regular operations. 600 would be on the payroll by the time the end came. 900 bicycles rolled out the door every week at peak capacity. The CCM name was in 40 countries. Bikes in summer, skates in winter, and a workforce that still lived in the small houses on Gibson Avenue, still walked to the plant in the morning dark, still felt the forge heat push back the January cold when they stepped through the factory doors. It was 1968. Expo 67 had just shown the world a confident, modern Canada. Pierre Trudeau was about to become Prime Minister. The country felt young and certain of itself. And CCM, 70 years old, a 250,000 square feet of humming production on Lawrence Avenue, felt permanent. But Tom Neese wouldn't be president forever. The Bobby Hull contract would come up for renewal. And the men who controlled CCM's future, the Levy brothers, who'd acquired a controlling interest through Levy Industries, were already looking at that $25,000 annual check and asking whether a hockey player was really worth the money. Somewhere on the other side of the Pacific, in factories the Weston workforce had never heard of, manufacturers in Japan were building bicycles that were lighter, faster, and cheaper than anything CCM could produce on equipment that hadn't been replaced since the plant was new. The summit is always the place where you can see the farthest. It's also the place where the ground begins to fall away. Chapter 7. The Men Who Inherited What They Didn't Build. Tommy Russell's philosophy, shared responsibility, wasn't a slogan painted on a wall and forgotten. It was an operating principle. Quality products at fair prices. workers receiving the fullest share possible of the return they helped produce. For nearly 4 decades, it had governed every decision at CCM, from the grade of steel in the frame tubes to the wages on the factory floor. It was the reason the brand meant something. After Russell died in 1940, that philosophy began to erode, not overnight, not in any single boardroom vote, but gradually, the way a building loses heat when nobody tends the furnace, so slowly you don't notice until your breath is visible. The Levy brothers changed everything. Levy Industries, also known as Levy Brothers Auto Parts, acquired a controlling interest in CCM in the 1960s. Ben Levy and his family took command of a company they hadn't built, a workforce they didn't understand, and a brand whose value they saw primarily in what could be extracted from it. A person with family connections to the Levys would later write a blunt assessment. CCM was owned by Levy Industries in the 60s. My aunt married a Levy, and I watched them totally mismanage the company, fight with their unions, miss the first bike boom, wreck the brand. The fighting with the unions was immediate and sustained. CCM's workers were represented by the United Auto Workers, and under Levy ownership, labor relations deteriorated from functional to toxic. The UAW would later accuse the Levys of profit gouging, taking money out of the operation while refusing to put money back in. The equipment on the factory floor at 2013 Lawrence Avenue was aging. Some of it dated to the plant's constructions in 1917. Workers were asked to produce more bicycles, faster, on machines that were wearing out. Quality suffered. The brand's reputation, built over 6 decades of careful manufacturing, began to fray at the edges. And then came the boardroom war. Norton Cooper, owner of the Seaway hotel chain, launched a bid for control of CCM. What followed was a protracted courtroom and boardroom battle between Cooper and Ben Levy that consumed years of management attention and corporate resources. While the two men fought over who would own the company, nobody was running it. Historians would later describe CCM during this period as being in a precarious state, a polite way of saying the place was falling apart while the owners were busy suing each other. The timing couldn't have been worse, because while the Levy-Cooper struggle played out in Toronto courtrooms, the world bicycle market was undergoing the most dramatic transformation since the safety bicycle replaced the penny farthing. The first blow came from overseas, and it arrived on 10 speeds. The 1970s bicycle boom, driven by the oil crisis, the fitness movement, and a generation of young adults rediscovering cycling, should have been CCM's golden opportunity. Demand for bicycles surged across North America. People who hadn't ridden since childhood were walking into shops looking for lightweight, multi-speed machines that could handle distance and hills. The 10-speed bicycle became the product of the decade. CCM couldn't make one, not a competitive one. The manufacturing equipment at Weston, presses, jigs, brazing fixtures designed for heavy single-speed and 3-speed frames, was incapable of producing the lightweight tubing and precise derailleur geometry that the 10-speed demanded. Retooling would have required significant capital investment. The Levy brothers weren't investing, they were extracting. Into that gap poured imports, English racing bikes from Raleigh and Carlton, Italian frames from Bianchi, and, most damagingly, Japanese bicycles from manufacturers who had studied the North American market with the same systematic intensity they'd brought to automobiles and electronics. The Japanese bikes were lighter. They shifted better. The components were more precisely machined. And they were cheaper. The parallel with America tells a story in miniature. Jay Townley, who served as vice president of manufacturing at Schwinn, the American equivalent of CCM, would later admit the truth with devastating clarity. We watched the Taiwanese when what we should have done was adopted their practices. We did not invest. In Schwinn Plant No. 2, we had the same presses the government put in World War II to make machine gun barrels and ammunition, and we were still using them. CCM had the same presses, the same problem, the same refusal to invest, and a smaller domestic market that made the math even harder. By the late 1970s, Taiwan had emerged as the next wave of competition: lighter bikes, lower costs, volumes that no Canadian factory could match. behind Taiwan, China was already tooling up. The tariff wall that had sheltered CCM since 1899, the national policy duties that had given the original five-company merger its reason for being, still stood, but it was no longer enough. The protection kept the cheapest imports at bay. It couldn't make CCM's outdated factory competitive against manufacturers who were building better products for less money. The Bobby Hull endorsement contract came up for renewal. The Levy brothers looked at the $25,000 annual cost, the deal that had put CCM on the cover of Time magazine, that had made every kid in Canada want CCM skates, and decided it was too expensive. They let Bobby Hull walk away, the most important marketing asset CCM had ever possessed, and they killed it over $25,000 a year. Chapter 8. The Starving Time. The Cummings family of Montreal acquired CCM from the Levys in the late 1970s. They arrived with neither the capital nor the intention to save what was failing. What they wanted, according to the historical record, was financial assistance from the Ontario government, a bailout, essentially, to keep the factory running on someone else's money while the new owners assumed as little risk as possible. Ben Virgilio had made what historians describe as a valiant attempt to turn the company around in the final Levy years. But when the Cummings family refused to invest new capital, Virgilio departed in frustration in 1978. He'd seen the books. He knew what the factory needed, and he knew the new owners wouldn't provide it. What the factory needed was everything: new brazing equipment, new paint lines, new assembly tooling, engineering capacity to design competitive multi-speed bicycles, a product development budget that reflected the reality of a global market where standing still meant falling behind. None of it came. Instead, the workers at 2013 Lawrence Avenue were asked to do what they'd always done: build bicycles and skates on machines that were now more than 60 years old, in a plant that hadn't seen meaningful capital investment in over a decade. The quality problems that had begun under the Levys accelerated under the Cummings family. CCM bicycles, once the standard by which Canadian manufacturing was measured, developed a reputation for inconsistency. The brand name still carried weight with older customers who remembered what it used to mean, but younger buyers, the ones walking into shops during the bike boom, looking for a 10-speed they could ride to work, were choosing Japanese or Italian or Taiwanese machines that cost less and worked better. In 1982, the company changed its name. Canada Cycle and Motor Company, the full, proud title that had announced a national champion in 1899, was shortened to simply CCM. 3 letters. No country in the name anymore, no ambition. Just an abbreviation of something that used to be larger. The federal government extended substantial loans to keep the operation alive. The exact figures would emerge later in a Globe and Mail headline by journalist Jack Willoughby. CCM's failure could cost Ottawa almost $13 million to cover loans. $13 million of public money poured into a company whose owners wouldn't invest their own. By 1982, CCM was hemorrhaging money. The expected operating loss for the year was $4.3 million. The company's liquidation value stood approximately $12 million less than its total debts. The factory on Lawrence Avenue, Russell's Cathedral, the place where 10 million bicycles had been born, was running on borrowed time and borrowed money, and both were running out. The 600 people who punched the clock every morning at 2013 Lawrence Avenue knew it before the newspapers did. You can feel a factory dying. The orders thin out. The overtime disappears. Suppliers start calling about late payments. The union steward's face gets a little tighter every week. And the machines that had been complaining for years, the presses that shuddered where they used to cycle smooth, the jigs that needed shimming every shift. The machines told you everything you needed to know about whether anyone with authority believed this place had a future. Nobody with authority believed it had a future. Chapter 9. October. On October 13th, 1982, Canada Cycle and Motor Company was placed in receivership. 83 years after 5 bicycle companies merged to defend against an American invasion, the company those men had built was finished. The receivership was not a restructuring. It was not a pause. It was the beginning of the end. On October 30th, a meeting at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto, the same city where the Peterborough Methodist Mafia had once pulled the levers of Canadian finance, produced a moratorium on all payments to creditors, secured and unsecured, while someone tried to find a buyer. Cooper Canada Limited, then the country's largest sporting goods manufacturer, bid $5 million for the hockey and skate operation. They were outbid. On December 8th, Quebec Industry Minister Rodrigue Biron announced that CCM's assets had been purchased by Gestion R.A.D. Inc., a holding company associated with Procycle Group of Saint-Georges in the Beauce region of Quebec, owned by Raymond Dutil. The price was $8 million. The sale was completed on January 22, 1983. $8 million. For a company that had built 10 million bicycles, that had armed 2 world wars, that had supplied 90% of the NHL with skates, that had put its name on the covers of school scribblers in every classroom in the country. $8 million, and even that came from Quebec, not Ontario. The jobs, the machinery, the legacy, all of it heading east. Ontario Premier William Davis argued that the interim receiver had little alternative but to accept what appeared to be a reasonable offer from Procycle. There was, Davis said, simply no investor willing to continue bicycle operations in Ontario. No investor willing to continue. That sentence contains the entire tragedy. Not that nobody could, that nobody would. The union responded with fury. UAW Administrative Assistant Robert Nickerson wrote to Premier Davis on January 10, 1983, decrying poor management by the CCM Corporation and profit gouging by the previous owners, the Levy brothers. The sale of CCM's jobs to a Quebec company provoked what was described as a swift and heated reaction from the Weston community. The workers knew exactly what had happened. Management had extracted, starved, and abandoned the company, and the workers were the ones who'd pay. The Levy brothers, it should be noted, still owned the physical property in Weston, the building, the land, the 13.2 acres on Lawrence Avenue. They'd sold the operating company. They kept the real estate. They would profit from the site long after the 600 people who'd made it valuable had lost everything. Gord Chard was among the last to leave. He'd worked at CCM for 39 years, nearly 4 decades in the tool and die department, building and maintaining the equipment that built the bicycles. He'd played hockey on the CCM company team. He'd watched Tommy Russell's factory rise, peak, and hollow out under owners who never understood what they had. Chard was given 2 weeks. 2 weeks to empty the place, to shut it down, to walk through a factory he'd entered as a young man and leave it as an old one, knowing that the machines he'd kept running would never run again. John McKenty, who would later write the definitive history of CCM, interviewed Chard when the former employee was 85 years old. McKenty described the task of closing the factory as devastating. 2 weeks, 39 years of work, 2 weeks to bury it. By March 1983, the factory on Lawrence Avenue stood empty. The loading docks where rail cars had once been packed with bicycles bound for 40 countries were silent. The brazing shop was dark. The forge was cold. The assembly line, where 900 bikes a week had rolled toward the crating station, where workers had test-ridden each one on that short stretch of factory floor, was still. 600 paychecks, gone. No documented worker retraining program was established following the closure. The people who had built CCM's bicycles and laced CCM's skates for decades were, by all available evidence, left to find their own way in an economy that had less and less use for the things they knew how to do. Chapter 10. What happened to everything? The assets were divided like an estate where nobody in the family is speaking. Gestion R.A.D. and Procycle kept the bicycle division and the right to stamp CCM on every frame that left their Quebec factory. The hockey division, the skates, the helmets, the tax line, the NHL relationships, was sold on a going concern basis to Sport Masca Incorporated, owned by David Zunenschein, a Montreal real estate developer who also ran a hockey jersey manufacturer in Saint-Hyacinthe. Two companies, two futures. One brand, split in half. The bicycles disappeared first. Under Procycle, no CCM bicycles were produced for approximately 2 years. Production resumed in 1985 at Procycle's Quebec facilities, not in Weston, not in Toronto, not in Ontario. By 2004, Procycle was building 200,000 CCM branded bikes per year, but that year, all production moved overseas. Raymond Doodle cited the rising Canadian dollar and easy access to Asian producers as the reasons. The number of bicycles imported into Canada nearly doubled between 2000 and 2004, from 538,000 to over a million. Canadian bicycle manufacturing was finished. Today, the CCM bicycle brand is licensed to Canadian Tire Corporation. The bikes are manufactured by contractors in Asia, primarily Taiwan and China, and sold as entry-level budget products. No connection to the original manufacturing exists. The brand trades entirely on nostalgia, on the memory of something it no longer is. As McKenty observed, most people who are buying CCM bikes these days are doing it because of the nostalgic appeal of the CCM name. The hockey side took a different path, wilder, more violent, and ultimately more successful. Zunenschein acquired the CCM skateblade manufacturer St. Lawrence Manufacturing in 1985, shortened the company to SLM Canada, picked up bankrupt Coleco Industries in 1988, and took the whole operation public in 1991 as SLM International. The stock rose 71% in months. Then his real estate company filed for bankruptcy in 1994, and SLM's share price crashed from over $30 to under $7. Chapter 11 followed in October 1995 with $184.6 million in debt. The company emerged in 1997 under new CEO Gerald Wasserman. In 1998, SLM acquired Sports Holdings Corpa, gaining Coho, Titan, Jofa, Canadian, and Heaton, and became the world's largest producer of hockey equipment, with sales exceeding $200 million. The company renamed itself the Hockey Company in 1999. Reebok bought it in 2004 for approximately $329 million. Adidas bought Reebok in 2005 for $3.8 billion. The CCM hockey brand, born from Tommy Russell's scrap steel skate blades in 1905, was now owned by a German sportswear conglomerate. Adidas phased out the Reebok name from hockey between 2013 and 2015, putting everything under CCM. Then, in 2017, Adidas sold CCM Hockey to Birch Hill Equity Partners, a Toronto-based private equity firm, for roughly $100 million. The brand was losing money. Under CEO Rick Blackshaw, hired in 2018, and his successor, Marwan Nabi, appointed in 2021, CCM Hockey was rebuilt. In October 2024, Altor Equity Partners of Stockholm acquired a majority stake at an enterprise value of approximately $600 million. Birch Hill earned an 11-fold return on its 2017 investment. The TAC skate line, retired in 2006, was reintroduced in 2014 after demand from players at every level of the game. Today, CCM Hockey holds approximately 35% of the global hockey equipment market, operates in over 40 countries, and serves as the official equipment supplier of the NHL, the ECHL, the USHL, the CHL, and the AHL. Sidney Crosby wears CCM. Connor McDavid wears CCM. Alexander Ovechkin, Austin Matthews, Nathan McKinnon, Carey Price. The names change, the three letters don't, from a fraction of an $8 million bankruptcy sale to a $600 million enterprise. The hockey brand survived because every owner, through every bankruptcy, every restructuring, every change of corporate nationality, kept investing in the product and kept the connection to the players who used it. The bicycle brand died because it became a label on a box, disconnected from any craft, any community, any purpose beyond price. Chapter 11. The Parking Lot, where 10 million bicycles were born. The factory stood empty for 3 years. From March 1983 to April 1986, the 232,000 square feet of manufacturing space on Lawrence Avenue sat abandoned. Windows darkening, the railway siding unused, the loading docks where bikes had been crated for 40 countries, collecting nothing but weather. Weston carried on around it the way a town carries on around a closed church, not quite willing to look at it, not quite able to look away. In April 1986, Greenspoon Brothers Limited, then Canada's largest demolition contractor, began tearing it down. Amadio Veloci supervised the work. City of York, Mayor Alan Tonks and town staff walked the site one last time before the wrecking began. John McKenty was there with a camera. No heritage designation had been sought. No heritage designation had been granted. Would echo for decades. The difficulties would echo for decades. The difficulties in researching industries in general points to a great need for the development of a proper archives for industrial history. The archive was never developed. The building came down. The 13.2-acre site became a strip mall. Today, the former factory address, 2013 Lawrence Avenue West, is occupied by a Tim Hortons, a Wendy's, a fire station at 2015 Lawrence Avenue West, which houses the old Weston Town Hall bell. Single-story commercial units fill the rest. The railway tracks remain adjacent, carrying freight that has nothing to do with bicycles. A visitor in 2015 noted a line of ice cream trucks parked along those tracks, behind the commercial buildings, sitting on the same ground where loaded rail cars of CCM bicycles once departed for destinations across the British Empire. Ice cream trucks, where the bikes used to be. Weston itself carried the wound for a long time. CCM and Moffat Stoves, another anchor employer, established in 1892, producers of stoves and ranges shipped worldwide, both closed in 1983. The simultaneous loss was devastating. The small houses on Gibson Avenue, built for factory workers, still stand. But the factory that gave them their reason doesn't. Community member Ross recalled what happened next. When Ross was growing up in Weston, all her family's shopping was done in the town. Manufacturers such as CCM were big employers in the town. Most have left. And when the mall came, Ross was among those who giddily took their money outside the area. We thought, why shop at Weston Road when you can go to Yorkdale Mall? As an adult, I realize I helped kill Weston Road. Mary Louise Ashbourne, whose family roots in Weston date to 1904, put it differently. Weston was Weston before Toronto was Toronto. The neighborhood changed. Approximately 50% of Weston's residents today are immigrants. 70% are low to moderate income. More than 30 ethnic groups are represented, with the largest communities from the Caribbean and West Africa. The UP Express station opened in 2015, bringing new transit access and new pressure. Rents jumped. Longtime resident Charlene Henry told the CBC that rents had risen by $1,000 in 5 years. It feels like they want all of the people of color out of this community. Carla Scott, the local Acorn chapter chair, organized anti-gentrification rallies in 2018. The old CCM factory at 201 Weston Road, the pre-1917 Lozier building where Russell first consolidated operations, survives. It's a loft conversion now, 20 units, described as trendy vintage. The residents, reportedly, don't know what was built there. Bicycle-themed lampposts line Weston Road. Models of bicycles hang from the streetlights. Green and gold road signs identify Weston as the home of the bicycle. A commemorative plaque for Canada Cycle and Motor exists somewhere in the area. No formal oral history project focused on CCM workers has ever been undertaken. No documentary film about CCM has been produced. The Toronto Historical Association has explicitly called for the City of Toronto Archives to develop a proper industrial collection. It hasn't happened. The living memory of CCM's factory floor is disappearing as the last generation of workers ages out of reach. John McKenty wrote the definitive history, Canada Cycle and Motor, the CCM story, published in 2011 with 150 vintage photographs. His personal collection of CCM memorabilia was auctioned by Miller and Miller Auctions on December 7th, 2019. The catalog described it as preserving a story that was in danger of being lost forever. The Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa holds the Shields collection, over 3,000 items assembled by collector Lorne Shields across more than 50 years, including CCM artifacts and a surviving Russell automobile. The vintage CCM community online, founded by McKenty himself, remains the gathering place for collectors, historians, and the handful of former employees still living. That's what's left. Lampposts and plaques, and a website, and a collection in Ottawa, and a Tim Hortons on Lawrence Avenue. Tommy Russell's philosophy, shared responsibility, quality for the public, the fullest share for the workers, died long before the factory did. The Levy brothers didn't share. The Cummings family didn't invest. And when the moment came that demanded adaptation, when the 10-speed revolution arrived, when Japanese manufacturers proved you could build a better bicycle for less money, when the market begged for something new, CCM had neither the equipment, the management, nor the vision to respond. The men who controlled the company couldn't see past the margins to the product. They couldn't see past the quarter to the decade. They looked at Bobby Hull's endorsement contract and saw an expense. They looked at the factory floor and saw a cost. They never understood that what Russell had built wasn't a company that happened to make bicycles and skates. It was a promise to the workers, to the customers, to the country. And when you break a promise like that, you don't just lose a business. You lose something that doesn't come back. The bicycle-themed lampposts on Weston Road still glow at night. The green and gold signs still read, "Home of the Bicycle." But the home is empty now. Named Gordchard spent 39 years keeping the machines running because he believed, the way Tommy Russell had believed, that the work mattered. The lampposts are beautiful. The bicycles hanging from them were made somewhere else.